You want to know the best Ubisoft game? Well, you've come to the right place. Hey, it's Game Rant, and this week on Gamers Said, we asked, what's your favorite Ubisoft game? And kicking us off this week is Kea, who says, quote, AC Odyssey, played 8 times, end quote. Fantastic answer. Assassin's Creed Odyssey is my personal favorite of the series as well, and we'll get to this later on, but honestly, can we even call this an Assassin's Creed game? At first, it feels a bit like the comic book movie 300 with all this Spartan imagery, before making a hard pivot to the supernatural, and your protagonist gains godlike powers even before this narrative thread is introduced. Epic gets thrown around a lot, but starting as a humble farmer to captain a ship and become a god, well, few games can meet the epic scale of Assassin's Creed Odyssey. And wait a minute, 8 times? Now, I'm no completionist, but even my best efforts put me closer to triple-digit hours and no ending in sight. Heck, if you're just coasting on the main campaign, you're still looking closer to 50 hours of game. And that's before introducing the excellent DLC. So Kea, if you played this game 8 times, I can't blame you. Behind every corner lies another well-written side mission. Up next is Ernst, who names a franchise we might not be seeing for a while. Quote, Watch Dogs 2, end quote. And yes, despite a passionate fan base, the Watch Dogs franchise may not ever see another entry on its own, as internal rumblings following Watch Dogs Legion put the whole series on the shelf. And to some extent, I can kind of understand where Ubisoft is coming from. The first Watch Dogs was an interesting but flawed open-world game that borrowed more from its contemporaries than its initial hacker action trailer led players to believe. Watch Dogs 2 made several improvements, including a much better story remarking on the contemporary issues of Silicon Valley, going so far as to remake Google headquarters for a mission. And then came Watch Dogs Legion, my personal favorite, and a game I will beg and plead everyone to give it a try. In it, you are someone. Anyone, really. No, you won't be making your own characters, but instead traveling around London recruiting old ladies for underground boxing tournaments, or geeky hackers to storm Parliament. It can regularly be found for less than $10. If you're a fan of Cyberpunk 2077, this is the Saints Row to that game's Grand Theft Auto. Up next is Aiden, who says, quote, the Splinter Cell is one of my favorites, end quote. And again, big agree, Aiden. Splinter Cell was a fascinating take on the stealth espionage genre, so, you know, Metal Gear Solid, but made by Ubisoft. Or so we thought, as the series' driven realism down to the gross environments of mercenary groups and the pristine settings of government buildings, you truly felt like you'd stepped into the world of Tom Clancy. And this time, you didn't have backup. Instead, the Grey Wolf Sam Fisher used his expertise and lower back pain to save America, one pair of night goggles at a time. But much like Watch Dogs, it eventually fell out of favor with Ubisoft, and we haven't seen a real Splinter Cell game in some time. But thankfully, back in 2021, Ubisoft announced the first game in the franchise would receive a remake. However, the company has been mum since making that announcement. So while we're still waiting for new details, here's hoping some of those classic games find their way to modern consoles. Those PS3 HD versions weren't perfect, but Splinter Cell fans would take them back in a second. See Fireball Gamer 12 chimes in with something a little different. Quote, I'm not 100% sure it's not a Nintendo game, but I know Ubisoft was a big part of making it. Probably Mario plus Rabbids. Either one is my favorite, end quote. And you're absolutely right, see Fireball Gamer 12. This is an Ubisoft game, made by the teams at Ubisoft Milan and Ubisoft Paris. While enough art and details had leaked prior to the game's announcement, there was still a palpable disbelief to see the Mario crew, laser firearms in hand, teaming up with Rabbids doppelgangers. Now, personally speaking, I enjoy the franchise, but I've never quite clicked with the turn-based strategy gameplay. I seem to get everything right, but it doesn't feel quite as satisfying as XCOM or Fire Emblem, 2 franchises I really enjoy. Still, there's plenty of charm in the goofy music and colorful visuals, and its lack of violence makes this a great starter turn-based strategy for kids. Up next is Jacob, who says, quote, I honestly enjoy the Watch Dogs franchise and the Crew games, end quote. And since we've already chatted Watch Dogs, what do you say we review the Crew franchise? Launching all the way back in 2014, the game combined the world design of Ubisoft with the gameplay of a racing game. In fact, the first game only recently ended service earlier this year, and while that version of the game may be gone for good, 2 more live on in the Crew and the Crew Motorfest. The party has only opened up since the first, with cars now being joined by boats and planes. By land, sea, or air, players can race all around the world, breaking records and practicing tricky maneuvers all along the way. It may not have the refined gameplay of more simulation-based racers such as Forza or Gran Turismo, but this is a great racing game for players who don't want to limit themselves to burning rubber. Up next is is Masood, who says, quote, Far Cry 3 was a very good game, but I can't imagine anyone who actually played Assassin's Creed, specifically Brotherhood Black Flag, can even think of any other IP than AC. Ubisoft has lost the fire inside, but I would still play any AC games any day of the week, end quote. And Masood, this is one heck of a loaded answer. Far Cry 3 certainly is the entry that flipped the franchise from PC curio to mainstream shooter, thanks in large part to its superb opening few hours that showed a party boy go from dud to stud, facing off against world-class death squads. Far Cry 2 will probably always be a fan favorite to a certain generation, but Far Cry 3 keeps being ported and re-released over and over again. Sorry, Voss, we know it's the definition of insanity. And let's address Masood's other point and talk a little bit about Assassin's Creed again, as he wasn't the only person to mention the older games. Jake says, quote, Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag. It took all the best lessons from previous games, then add pirate ships and sea shanties to it. Not much more you can ask for, end quote. And as much of a fan as I am of modern Assassin's Creed games, I have to concede the point to Masood and Jake. They aren't very much like the Assassin's Creed franchise of a decade ago. Heck, Black Flag was the last numbered entry of the bunch. And I don't think it's a coincidence that fans name-check it as their favorite. After the story of Desmond, ended, yeah, let's go with that. Story ended. Assassin's Creed could go in any direction. With Black Flag, they chose a game within a game, and a quirky, offbeat story that certainly doesn't have the clean lineage to Assassins of old, but instead to Pirates of the Sea. For some fans, Pieces of Eden are all well and good for fantasy flourish, but playing as a god is just a different game. No wonder Ubisoft is remaking Black Flag. Man, they sure are remaking a lot of bangers. Up next, we have an anonymous user who says, quote, Ghost Recon Breakpoint and Ghost Recon Wildlands, end quote. And I'm gonna assume you've got yourself an online crew. Breakpoint and Wildlands are games of two halves. If you're playing alone, you might get a kick out of the hyper-tactile approach to missions, but it'll be incredibly slow and likely very boring. And hey, you really can't blame Ghost Recon. It's just a different sort of game. It's so devoted to its multiplayer design that if you get a few friends together, you're bound to have a good time working together to silently nab the head of a cartel or accidentally set off all of the alarms and go in guns blazing for one very messy, very funny outcome. In either scenario, you'll have a gigantic arsenal of weapons and some very handy vehicles inside one of the biggest open world games around. So yeah, not a single player success, but multiplayer is a joy to behold. Next, we have 50 Shades with a real throwback. Quote, Prince of Persia Sands of Time and Far Cry 3, end quote. And yes, Prince of Persia has now been part of the Ubisoft family for more than 2 decades, but it wasn't always an Ubisoft property. After the dire Prince of Persia 3D, Ubisoft acquired the rights to the series and created Sands of Time. Now picture this. Games have load times. Load times happen after a fail state, which can be frustrating, which is why many 3D games avoided challenging platforming for some time. But some clever use of technology and narrative allowed players to rewind time in Sands of Time, all the way to their last mistake. It was such a great idea, it's been borrowed from all sorts of games, from puzzles to racing titles. As for the Prince, well, the newest game, Prince of Persia The Lost Crown, didn't light up the sales charts, but critics and fans love this spin-off, and the new series protagonist Sargon. And yes, we have another Ubisoft remake with Sands of Time expected in 2026. Up next is Andrew Shorntorm, who says, quote, Ghost Recon Wildlands and Breakpoint, The Division 1 and 2, AC Black Flag, Unity, Watch Dogs 1, end quote. And we've touched on all of these except The Division 1 and 2. And remember everything we just said with Ghost Recon? Well, you can flip it here. Single players are more than welcome, especially in Part 2 as the game grows the ability of players to create their own forms of backup and supportive fire. But here's a bit of shocking news. It's been a whole 5 years since The Division 2. So where the heck is the series going? Well, it's actually been a couple of strange years for The Division. The RPG shooter was supposed to get a follow-up in Heartland. Heck, Ubisoft was holding public online tests. But ultimately, the company decided to cancel the project and move on to The Division 3. And that's all the information we have at the moment. Instead, The Division 2 had to pivot to DLC to fill the gaps. And to its credit, the Warlords of New York post-release content was surprisingly rich. But that begs the question, where is The Division heading next? We've gone from New York City to Washington, D.C., and it sure seems like rural areas are out of the question after Heartland. And lastly, for this week's Gamers Said, we have Stalin Sin, who says AC Valhalla, Far Cry, Anno, and the Division series. End quote. And good call on Anno, a franchise that I've never quite been able to gauge the popularity of. So if you're a fan of Anno, let me know in the comments below. But this RTS game has thrived with several entries, becoming a fan favorite in European territories like Germany. But speaking personally, I've never met an Anno fan in person, and that's one of the more impressive aspects of Ubisoft. Sure, they release monster franchises like Assassin's Creed and the Tom Clancy series, but they've always made time for regional games, smaller games, which allow for greater expression or chase an idea that may not be mainstream but makes an artistic statement. Games like Anno and Child of Light spring to mind. This beautiful ode to the JRPG is still unlike any other turn-based role-playing game. And Valiant Hearts: The Great War, while not exactly my kind of game, did help educate players on the horrors of World War I with effective storytelling and art. Which is why this week I'm going to suggest everyone who enjoyed this video check out my recommendation, Far Cry Primal. This criminally underrated spin-off of the Far Cry series throws us back to 10,000 BC as an early member of the human tribe. Ubisoft did a ton of research to make this game as accurate as possible, while still being a ton of fun. And it's a great kicking off point if you've ever wanted to learn more about this crazy species known as mankind. But one quick sidebar, I would suggest the versions in this order. PC is best, Xbox Series S and X, and lastly PS5. Why? Well, sadly the PS5 has no enhancements. Meanwhile, Xbox runs at a solid 60 frames per second, but to really see what this game has to offer, check out the PC version. A first-person shooter 11,000 years before the first firearm was created. Yeah, it's a pretty bonkers experience. Let's hope we get a modern gen port of this hidden gem. But anyway, that's gonna do it for this week's Gamer Said. I want to thank everyone who submitted their answers and encourage everyone to continue the conversation in the comments below. Keep clicking around here on Game Rant, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, everybody.